Now joined by Frankie Corrado and TSN Overdrive host Brian Hayes. Fellas, the Leafs have had a busy offseason, to say the least. They found a new head coach in Craig Berube, revamped the blue line, and brought in Anthony Stolarz to back up Joseph Woll. Hayes, do these changes even matter if they're just going to run it back with the core?
No, I don't think it does in terms of my projection on how they're going to play in the playoffs, Jermaine. You know, that's what we're talking about here. This is a really good regular season team. They have been for quite some time. I like Tanev coming aboard. I like Ekman-Larsson coming aboard. I'm intrigued by Stolarz and Woll as a tandem. And I really like the hiring of Craig Berube. So it's not as if those players and that coach will not have a positive impact on this team. But this is not the chicken or the egg. And it never really has been. When you have 5 players, the core 4 up front, and I'll throw Morgan Rielly in there, taking up more than half of your salary cap, and they're clearly the best players who are going to play the most minutes in the most prominent positions. If they can't drag you to the promised land, it doesn't matter who your third pairing defense is. It doesn't matter what type of system you're running. What matters is whether or not those players can get it done. And historically, and there's been a lot of history here, a lot of data. This isn't a one-off. This isn't a rash commentary that I'm bringing to the table here. This is year after year after year. The best players have not been able to drag them to the promised land. And the reality is the core 4 with Rielly, they've been here for a long time. Basically, every other teammate of theirs has filtered in and out. There's been tons of different centermen, wingers, defensemen, goalies, coaches, GMs. It's always about the constant, and the constant is that they can't get it done in the playoffs. So I like the moves. I like the people they brought in here. But if the core 4 up front and Morgan Rielly don't improve in terms of being clutch in the playoffs, for me, it's not going to change anything.
Well, and that's where Craig Berube has to come into play here, Hayes, because, you know, we've seen it with Mike Babcock. We've seen it with Sheldon Keefe. We know how it looks. And if you want to make moves off the core 4, there's plenty of evidence to show you that it hasn't worked in the past. But I would say this time around with Craig Berube coming in, it almost feels like you owe it to him to see what he can do with these guys. See if he can do something different. Yes, it's been a long time. They haven't been able to get over the hump. But the new coach coming in, like, think about that realistically, logistically. He's going to come in, you're going to trade a 90-point guy, 95-point guy, and tell him you're not even going to have a chance to work with that player, to work with this group. Last year, Brad Treliving came in. He didn't make any changes to the core. He surrounded them. He worked on the edges. Now you have a new coach. You work on the edges, and you see what these guys can do with the new coach. After this, and this sounds crazy to say because we've just seen it for so long, but after this, you should have your answer. You better have your answer that it hasn't worked with 3 coaches, hasn't worked with 2 general managers. That's if it doesn't work. If it works and Craig Berube finds a way, great. You stuck with it. You were patient. You didn't abandon your plan. But with the way things have gone here, working around the edges, revitalizing the D-core, having a new coach, it almost feels like you owe it to that coach to see what he can do before you make any seismic changes.
All about the edge work. And speaking of the core, John Tavares only has 1 year left on his deal. So it may be time for the Leafs to start considering if and or when they'll need to name a new captain. But first, Frankie, describe to us what the role of a captain is.
Well, I think you should be asking Hayes that because he's the captain of Overdrive. He's got to man that ship every day for 3 hours. But, like, you know, Hayes, good captains, here's what they do. Their players kind of take over their persona, their personality, and not all these guys are built the same. Not every captain is going to be a rah-rah guy. Some of them choose to lead by example. Actually, all of them have to lead by example in some way, shape, or form. But it does feel like, you know, that's the main message. When you're in the dressing room and it's game time, a lot of people want to chime in. Everyone has something to say. Everyone has a different viewpoint. When the captain talks, everyone listens. That is the #1 viewpoint that everyone is sharing. And he has to lead the way in terms of off-ice stuff, on the ice stuff. There's so much responsibility that a captain has to burden throughout the course of a season. But really what it comes down to is, how does your team take the reflection of the captain? Do you embody what that captain is all about? And sometimes, you know, certain captains, they maybe leave a little to be desired as far as, you know, the personality and how in your face they might be. And some captains are a little more understated. But it's all about how does your team react to what the captain is saying in the dressing room, because it's different than when the coach talks to the team.
And with that said, Hayes, this might be a tough one to answer, but should Toronto take the C off Tavares and put it on Auston Matthews, or is it too soon?
No, I don't think that has to happen, although I will say this. It might be in the best interest of John Tavares to take the lead role in that. I don't think this should be the organization penalizing John Tavares as if it's his fault that they're in the position that they're in. John obviously leaves a lot to be desired maybe at times when he speaks with the media. He can be somewhat robotic, but he shows up every single day. And yes, he's going into year 7 of a 7-year deal, and his game is not what it was 6 years ago. But I think John Tavares has been a consummate pro and done everything you could expect him to do up here, short of winning. But he's not the only reason for that. Matthews has to take responsibility. Marner takes responsibility. Nylander, Riley, Shanahan, the GMs, the coaches. So I think it actually would be an intriguing play and possibly a smart one for Tavares to read the tea leaves and be the one to proactively give the captaincy to Matthews and then take a step back in his final year in Toronto, if it is going to be his final year, certainly at $11 million, as we know. But I think what they needed to do was change the core. I mean, we've talked about this, Jermaine. We know this. Change the core. If you're going to be ruthless, if you're going to make a massive change the players. Make them leave and bring in new players. But if you're not going to do that, if you're not going to make it uncomfortable enough where you're going to force guys to either waive a no move or force them to leave town, I don't think this one lands. The idea that the only big move you're going to make in terms of in the room with the core, with the leaders, is taking the captaincy away from John Tavares and giving it to Auston Matthews. And on top of that, Matthews is the leader of this team. He's a great player. But he hasn't won anything either, right? He is not. I think he gets off the hook a lot in Toronto. Blame goes to Tavares. Blame goes to Marner. Goes to management. Auston has not been a big game player in the playoffs either. He's got to prove he can do that. And I'd like to see him take the bull by the horn and really prove publicly he wants it. He wants to be the guy, and he's pissed off with all the losing, and he won't handle it anymore. If that was his approach publicly, and then it's even more than that privately, then I'd certainly be on board with that. Obviously, it's the call of Tavares and the Leafs, but I'm not sure it's going to change anything if you rip it off Tavares now and give it to Matthews. Maybe you wait a year and you see where it goes.
Well, you really, in the absence of not making a big move to the core, that's all you'd be doing here if you do that, is trying to make someone uncomfortable, trying to make the room uncomfortable, because, you know, the way it has gone, that room, that core group, they have felt very comfortable. You know, there's never been any kind of notion that things are actually going to change within that group. But maybe if it happens internally instead of externally, that's the way you kind of make them uncomfortable and see how that changes things with the core group.
Yeah, great point. It reminds me of 2003 in Calgary when Craig Conroy was the captain. Daryl Sutter believed that Jarome Iginla was ready for the captaincy, and Conroy had a talk with Iginla privately. This is according to Connie, and he said, it's a big responsibility to be the captain of the team. If you want me to continue to be captain for another year, I'll be more than happy to do it. And Iginla was like, no way, I'm ready for it. Let's go. They ended up going to the Cup final that year as well. So to your point, Frankie, them taking the personality of the captain, that definitely happens, and it happened in the past as well. Tavares was named the Leafs captain ahead of the 2019-20 season, but since then, Auston Matthews has put up 35 more goals than any other skater in the league.